My name is Kim Geheb. I recently joined CIFOR-ICRAF as a senior scientist, and I'm also the coordinator of something called the central component of the Landscapes for Our Future program. This session is called The Future of Integrated Landscape Management, and CIFOR-ICRAF have been at the forefront of much of the global discussion around integrated landscape management approaches, together with partner organizations like, for example, Global Landscapes Forum, and in advancing that agenda into the 21st century and beyond. In this session, we set out to visualize the institutional and technical research demand of ILM into the future. So we've had more or less a decade of ILM research and practice. We want to think about, and if you like, imagine the future of ILM and where it goes from here, drawing on the lessons of the past decade or so. In this parallel session, we will draw on the combined experience of CIFOR-ICRAF research teams to propose several things. First of which, as I've just mentioned, how do we advance ILM? Second, how can it be implemented or better implemented to generate larger and more substantial impact? What are the practical challenges to its implementation, and how can we address these? And in what ways can ILM contribute to ameliorating the triple planetary crisis? So our session today will start with a couple of keynote presentations, and then followed by 3 lightning talks before we turn to debating some of these ideas and propositions to emerge from the presentations and talks that we'll be listening to. We have just an hour for this session, so I'll be trying to push through at a fair clip to allow debate at the end of the session. And I ask all of the speakers to try to stick to their time allocations. So to kick off the session, I'd like to now introduce our colleague, Dr. James Reed, who will be providing our opening keynote on operationalizing ILM, based on a decade of experience and interdisciplinary research approaches. So James, hopefully out there, over to you, please.
Thank you, Kim. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Is my presentation available to upload? Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to quickly provide a few reflections from the last decade of research on integrated landscape approaches that our team has been working on. So yeah, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Previous slide. Okay, so the previous slide was basically illustrating the evolution of integrated landscape approaches. So from, okay, we need to go back to now, if possible. But basically the emergence of many forms of integrated approaches, integrated natural resource management, ecosystem approaches, integrated rural development, etc., throughout the 70s, 80s, informed by conservation science, working at a broader landscape scale. And then more recently, in the past decade, there's been, this proliferation, if you like, of these so-called integrated landscape approaches, or their synonyms. A recent study showed that there's at least 80 synonyms of an integrated landscape approach. Yeah, and they've been embraced by all of the big conservation NGOs, multiple development agencies, and they're increasingly funded as well. So the UN agencies are also advocating for these more integrated approaches, whether it's the UN CBD and their Global Biodiversity Framework, or UNFCCC, or most recently the Global Land Outlook report from the UNCCD also explicitly mentioned integrated landscape approaches as a pathway towards transformational change for landscape management. And then, so onto this slide, why are they so popular? So integrated landscape approaches might aim to do one, or in most cases, many of the following things that you can see on the screen there. So whether it's enhanced resilience, improved governance, conserve biodiversity, etc., these approaches aren't single sector, they're not single stakeholder led, they're trying to bring together multiple stakeholders across multiple sectors and working at a larger scale. Next slide, please. Okay, and then there's been two recent review processes in the last few years, one led by ourselves at CIFOR and partners, which showed the increasing implementation of these types of approaches. And our review focused on the tropics. And as you can see, we found evidence across all tropical regions, and a number of approaches that spanned across regions as well. And then there was also another, next slide please, led by the Landscape for People, Food and Nature Network. And theirs was a global review. So they covered the four continents, and they found almost 500 examples of integrated landscape approaches. Next slide, please. But despite this widespread implementation effort, what our subsequent review found is that there's still limited evidence of the effectiveness of these approaches. And what was shown in the LPFN reviews was that the methodology that was used to develop that data set was basically came from practitioners, and it was self-reflection on the type of approaches they were implementing. And this was supported in our review, published in 2017, which you can see we had 174 case studies, like I said, from across the tropics, and 79 of those case studies were reporting successful outcomes. But when we dug deeper into the data, we were only able to find 15 examples that had what we would call credible data. And interestingly, from those 174, we didn't find a single example that showed any unsuccessful outcomes, which, if we're honest with ourselves, and if we understand these types of approach to be complex and multi-scale and long-term, then we would expect unsuccessful outcomes. In fact, one of the key principles of landscape approaches is understanding that there's going to be trade-offs, and then using that information to forward plan. So while it's somewhat of a positive story, there's so many successful examples, there isn't really a credible evidence base available to us at the moment which we can learn from. And this was supported by our subsequent kind of more mini review published in 2020, where we concluded by saying that despite the enthusiasm for landscape approaches, the evidence base remains poorly developed. Next slide, please. So in the last few years, there's been a number of publications that have come out that have tried to identify the challenges to implementation. And this one from 2 years ago from Dorothy Vermont and colleagues suggested that the main problems fall within these four categories. So problems related to participation, interaction, resource problems and institutional. And you can see, I mean, you can all read those problems listed there, but you can see there's some overlap amongst those problems, and these also support some of the challenges that we identified in a 2016 paper as well. And there's been a number of other papers that have been published in the last few years that have identified similar challenges. But I think definitely, you know, there's obviously consensus starting to show that there's limited capacity for implementing integrated landscape approaches across levels. There's challenges with engaging multiple stakeholders, particularly stakeholders that don't necessarily have a history of working together. With regard to resource problems, it says limited financial resources. I think also there's a time problem there as well. So we said in our publication that there's a time lag between understanding how to do the work and then the work happening, so a kind of knowledge implementation gap. But what we're finding with our current projects that we have running in Zambia, Indonesia, and Ghana is that there's also the time given to these processes. So it's also challenging to get people to invest that time without incentive structures there. And then, of course, you need the financial resources to provide those incentives sometimes. And a major challenge is how you ensure the long-term continuity of such approaches. And then institutional problems, again, how to manage kind of institutional structures across different scales, and then how to incorporate differing visions and what success means to different people. Next slide, please. So despite all those challenges, there has been some research that's published in the last couple of years that have shown some of the potential of integrated landscape approaches, and indeed shown that integration does underscore performance. So the top paper from Carmenta et al., published in 2020, used the data set from the LPFN network and managed to map out the different levels of integration across the different types of intervention. And what they showed is that those that are more integrated in their nature had more successful outcomes. And then the paper on the bottom in People and Nature, which is due to come out soon, compared 4 different types of intervention. So on the left, as I'm looking at the FLONA and the RESEX, are 2 sustainable use reserves, and then the 2 on the right are the less integrated approaches, so a protected area and a intensive soy intervention. And what the graph or the bubble chart show is that on the top line you have positive outcomes, and the larger bubbles you can see are on the more integrated approaches on the left. So they're more positive and more of them, and then contrastingly the less integrated have more negative and more of them. Next slide, please. And also, more good news is that application of integrated landscape approach principles can lead to transformational change. So 2 papers that again came out in 2020. One was in Ghana, one was in Uganda, and one showed that effective implementation could lead to a forest transition. So they were particularly focused on reforesting Ghana's degraded reserves using the landscape approach principles. And then the Uganda study showed that application of principles increased capacity, reduced conflict, made more clarity on mandates, roles, and responsibilities, and provided opportunities for policy influence. So again, these are positive signs. There are caveats to these studies. They are quite small scale, particularly the Ghana one, and they're new studies, so they're obviously not long term, so there's still plenty more learning to be done there. And another note with this is they use the landscape approach principles that were developed by Sayer et al. in 2013, which is a hugely influential paper and has been cited over 1,000 times. But these are 2 of the few examples that have actually applied those landscape approach principles despite the 1,000 or so citations. So we need to learn more from application as well. Next slide, please. So moving forward and some potential research opportunities. I'll go through these and try to spend a little bit of time on each. So across science, policy and practice, there remains a need for a better understanding of how to do integrated landscape approaches. So I think in our paper in 2017, we said that conceptualizing integrated landscape approaches still remains nascent. And I think in the last few years, understanding has definitely developed a lot. And I think there's a better understanding now of what an integrated landscape approach is. But I still think there's some confusion with regards to the different terminologies used. The fact that one landscape approach it doesn't exist. There's many different types of landscape approaches. So I think there's potential to improve how we define or characterize these types of approaches. And there's definitely scope to improve the methodology, the tools, the indicators that we need to use. And then within integrated landscape approaches, there's a need to recognize and harmonize plural values. And I think, this has been well recognized in the previous session, the fact that if you're trying to engage multiple stakeholders, there's going to be different objectives and needs. And so I think landscape approach needs to do a better job of recognizing those different values. I think that's something we're quite proud of in the projects we have going, particularly in Zambia. We've got a PhD student, Malika, looking at local knowledge systems and how we can incorporate those voices into decision making.
Thanks, James. Can you wind up, please?
Yeah, sure. So the private sector is an important but often absent actor. Again, we have research on this, but there's not enough been done of how we engage the private sector, why we should engage them, what are the benefits for local people, but also what are the benefits for private sector to engage. I need to better understand cross-scale dynamics. So again, this is a huge one, but could open up questions about how power relations manifest, how institutions that don't have that history of working together might engage better, how to reconcile local, national, international objectives. We need to question ourselves, do landscape approaches reinforce existing inequities? And I think, Kim opened up by saying CIFOR has led the agenda, but we need to have a bit of self-reflection and ensure that we're not dictating the agenda, if you like. I think I've talked about how to ensure continuity. We need to consider research fatigue and erosion of trust. What constitutes success and who benefits? We need to move away from the dichotomous language of success and failure and understand that there are long-term processes that are going to have trade-offs. But we need to use the opportunity of the seemingly increasing political will for these types of interventions and also the increasing funding opportunities that are being made available. Okay, that's it. Sorry for taking too long.
No, that was brilliant, James, and apologies for the technical problems. Moving on, for the second keynote, I'd like to turn the screen over to Dr. Cora van Oosten from the Global Landscapes Forum and the Wageningen Center for Development and Innovation. Cora's presentation is entitled Landscape Governance, Analyzing Challenges to Capacitating Stakeholders. Cora, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kim, and thank you very much, James, for this excellent start of the session. I assume you all see and hear everything correctly, so I'll kick off with my talk, which is a part of the integrated landscape management story. It's about landscape governance, and it starts with recognizing that today's global problems really, really require bold global solutions. And I think there's no need for you to explain why. There are bold solutions being proposed currently. We have the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and lots of pledges to restore the world ecosystems in the next 10 years with 1 billion hectares and trillion trees and God knows how many dollars that are to fund all this. And in general terms, a landscape approach has been adopted as landscapes are considered the best level for handling all sort of complicated trade-offs. But there are questions remaining, like where to restore and what to actually restore and how to restore. Who decides on what to restore where and for whom actually? And that's where landscape governance comes in. And I'm very happy to see that landscape governance as a concept has raised attention over the past few years. It almost seems to have become the new silver bullet to balance production and consumption and protection in a single space. And then increasingly, it is a sort of acknowledged or recognized that stakeholder engagement in this governance process is actually important and fairly easy. You know, you set up a platform or you constitute a partnership and then everything will be fine. But how easy is that really? So that's actually the reason why in Wageningen, together with the CIFOR, we studied a research on landscape governance. We studied a couple of cases where landscape governance has not been introduced externally, but was already on the ground sort of intrinsically. And we studied public-led governance in Rwanda, where it's attempted to combine restoration with food production. We also studied West Kalimantan, as many of you actually, where a private-led governance arrangement is implemented through multifunctional concession design, and another a civic-led governance arrangements that many of you already know. That's in Latin America, in the Amazon, transboundary social learning, a very great case that you are familiar with. Based on these case studies, we defined landscape governance as a place-based, multi-level and multi-stakeholder process of negotiation and decision-making for sustainable land use to balance the production, the protection, and the consumption needs of actors involved. Wow, that's a mouthful. Okay, landscape governance, based on that definition, we studied it can be manifested in many modes, in multiple, in public-led arrangements, in private-led arrangements, in civic-led arrangements. And actually, in all three cases, these different arrangements tend to overlap and coexist and evolve over time. They evolve, and now look at the graph, they evolve from single to multi-actor-led governance arrangements. And that trend that we saw over time is actually partly largely driven by levels of degradation, the drivers of degradation, general trends of democratization and decentralization. And it tends to
Francis.
Oops, somebody needs to be muted here. In all the cases, we encountered multiple challenges. First of all, substantive challenges. That's the challenge that relates to the landscape itself. Droughts, floods, degradation, deforestation, you name it. But we also encountered process challenges. And these process challenges are closely related to what was raised before, how to get stakeholders on board and balance power relations and really embark on a democratic governance process. We realized after some probing that these challenges are actually mostly connected to a scale mismatch between jurisdictional scales, you know, a village, county, region, country, etc., versus a landscape logic or a landscape scale, a biogeographical scale. And that means that political power and place-based or people's power tend to be separated, and that's not very practical. We see, however, that many local actors in all the cases did not sit and wait for problems to be solved. They undertook their own action and created landscape arrangements, place-based, socially accepted, and assumingly ecologically sustainable. Yet, where we saw these spontaneous arrangements, we also saw that these arrangements often remain informal. They remain, how you call it, in the shadow of hierarchy. I'm borrowing some authors, some of you here, and they are searching. They lack the legitimacy that they would need to make their outcomes last. Okay, that's the challenge. Now, what do these stakeholders do to overcome this challenge? Actually, a lot. They develop horizontal pathways. We saw that in all the cases. They blend customs with contemporary rules. They design integrated land use. They do all sorts of things to comply and fit in existing rules. But they do more. They also create or develop vertical pathways. That is, they connect to higher level officials, to national governments, and then even higher up, international fora such as the GLF, which help them to not only be creative within the rules, but also to stretch the rules and finally transform the rules by creating these clever networks across hierarchies. Well, now that is, I think, where we start talking, because that actually shows how landscape governance, if cleverly operationalized, can bridge between this scale divide, between the landscape logic and the administrative logic. But it's not crafted by researchers or by outsiders or by funders. It's created by creative and entrepreneurial landscape actors who actually craft committees, partnerships, all sort of arrangements that may start informal and legitimatized by social acceptance and the landscape sustainability, but that do manage to reconnect people and place. I'm almost done, don't worry. This looks great, but it requires some capabilities. So that's then the last stretch of what we did, finding out what are the capabilities that actually are needed by landscape actors to bridge these skill divides. First of all, substantive capabilities plus process capabilities that relates to the challenges, you remember. But besides that, also the institutional capabilities to connect institutions and to create these cleverly designed networks across levels and scales. The capability to do things differently and to engage in platforms and realms of connection where they did not do that before. The capability to engage, also to listen and to respect. And that is not done through teaching or through training, no way. It can only be done through the development or even the mobilization of meta capabilities, landscape capabilities for landscapes to collectively learn. This is actually the rough design behind GLF's Landscape Academy that is strongly rooted in this image. Now, the future of landscape governance, where we may have a debate, I strongly believe that the future of landscape governance lies in the reconfiguration of governance, that is, not staying within jurisdictions, but moving from jurisdictions to landscapes, which is a much better fit in many countries of this world where borders are actually artificial constructs. So from jurisdictions to landscapes, but that implies that there are new sources of legitimacy needed for these landscape arrangements, legitimacy that goes beyond the classical democratic structure of states. I also believe that the future is to move again. We moved from the community level to the landscape level. Now, I believe what is needed is to move from landscape level to wider political economies. So the positioning of landscapes within, well, what is currently called stewardship economies, which I believe is a great concept, and it gives a space for landscape approaches to be even more effective. It makes them thrive. And all that to be achieved by creating spaces for actors to connect, to learn, to join hands, and something that when I work with the GLF, I see that as a great model for that. And that would, I think, be underpinned with one thing, moving away from antithesis, thesis, antithesis, so all the time creating a new hype, to really to build synthesis and build upon landscape approaches, build upon landscape governance, and furthering the thinking and further building to make this world a better place. And herewith, I hand over back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cora. There was two superb presentations there from James and Cora, which we really appreciate. It sets the tone for the rest of the session, which is now, we're moving into phase 2 of that session. And we have 3 lightning talks for you. The first of these will be from Dr. Emily Gallager, our colleague, to speak on landscape perceptions and preferences, drawing on the experience of the governing multifunctional landscapes being led by CIFOR-ICRAF.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I have a lot of things in my hands, so I hope I can manage this. So good afternoon. I've been introduced and asked to speak about landscape perceptions, preferences, and lessons from governing multifunctional landscapes, which you learned about in the morning session. Governing, maybe you can help me advance the slides. No, that's 2 slides too many. Okay, let's just start here. So the Governing Multifunctional Landscapes project in Ghana, it's a project that spans many countries, was formerly called Territorial Approaches to Zero Deforestation Commodities. But times and buzzwords change, and we'll talk about that in our debate this afternoon. And we're now closer to working on jurisdictional approaches to climate smart commodities, where we're piloting a jurisdictional approach to map and monitor land use transitions and develop models for improved service delivery. So this is a dynamic landscape. I'll just keep talking while it catches up. With a biodiversity hotspot surrounded by cocoa, oil palm, rubber, artisanal mills, and mining. At first, we of course aim to map the crop drivers of deforestation, but the transitions from forest to crops is slight in this area compared to other regions, even cocoa. And more often we are seeing land use transitions between crops, because farmers in this landscape have choices about how to engage with value chains, crops, markets, business models, informal, formal sector. And we are seeing these transitions in the medium to short term through the spatialization of specific commodity activities. Next slide. Okay, so our work plan for this integrated approach to landscape governance and management takes steps to map land use and land use transitions, identify barriers and constraints for adopting climate smart practices and technologies, and looks for opportunities and levers for transitions to sustainable intensification. Click. And our approach is, of course, through multi-stakeholder platforms. Next slide. In addition to analyzing farmer adoption and decision-making aspirations and optimization modeling of different pathways, we are interested in understanding how this landscape is produced, reproduced, or transitioning. And we begin by understanding the different stakeholder perceptions of the landscape from their everyday lived experiences of landscape or from a distant government office with responsibility over that space. So there's a human component to this involving past experiences, knowledge, expectations. There's a landscape component involving landscape features and landscapes as a whole. And then there are the landscape effects and the outcomes of the human environment interaction. Next slide. So we know that land use mapping itself is a discursive practice that produces meaning through the categorization and spatialization of nature. They fix categories in time and space, obscuring the processes and the power dynamics behind selective classifiers. There are consequences for the categories that mappers choose to represent on the landscape. The land use classifiers that are selectively rendered inevitably leave off other parts of the map that are relevant to other stakeholders. They're unaccounted for. They're off the map. There are methods and approaches for eliciting landscape perceptions. And from our project, we have household surveys. We have focus group discussions where we've discussed landscape histories, landscape trajectories. And then we also have a process of doing three-dimensional landscape modeling, where we worked with those living in the landscape to develop the land use categories. So what's especially challenging is that landscape perceptions are slippery and they're not fixed, and that they can be molded by project participation, extension messaging, and interventions. Next slide, please. So this brings us to landscape perceptions and closer to planning for agricultural landscape futures. This is the nut that we are trying to crack right now. Our landscape preferences have to do with affinity for certain landscape features and their arrangement. And it's the physical, social, and aesthetic dimensions which are influenced by where you grew up, your culture, and indeed what you've been taught. So for farmers, landscape preferences shift with training, as they do with other stakeholder groups. And it's difficult to separate innate preferences from what is normal at the time. Can I take one more minute? We don't have virtual reality to play with in our landscape. We don't have that kind of funding. So we have to work with scenarios, and we have to work with work. From a theoretical perspective, from a social construction of knowledge perspective, what is important is that the planning process is to create a process, structure, and methodology to elicit subjective preferences of individuals. So all of these little dots are different people's landscape perceptions. If we can't work with individuals, we work with homogeneous stakeholder groups, and we follow their implementation pathways, the landscape trajectories and effects along these pathways to their desirable landscape futures. Next slide. And just keep clicking through the slide. So building our multi-stakeholder platform block by block, creating planning spaces where we are either trying to elicit individual subjectivities or trying to facilitate decision-making, consensus, or what's called planning knowledge, and its co-construction of knowledge involves consensus. Next slide, last slide. So participatory land use planning is this way of moving from these individual perceptions, working through consensus, these alternative pathways to a common landscape future. Participatory land use planning has been perceived as a tool for demystifying the planning process, not just for farmers or landscape level actors, and not just to assess their own needs or pull down services, but as capacity building instruments to demonstrate how space is planned and produced, how to see like a state, like an NGO, or like an extension program, and move from landscape perceptions, these reference scenarios, you can click again, these reference scenarios, negotiate alternative pathway scenarios, and arrive at a negotiated normative scenario. So scenario planning by design is intended to plan for multifunctional landscapes as a future condition through integrated landscape management.
Thanks so much, Emily. Now I'll turn the floor over to George Schoneveld, who you all know probably. He'll be talking about this new program that I referred to earlier, CIFOR-ICRAF, in which CIFOR-ICRAF is heavily involved, Landscapes for Our Future, which works together with 23 projects distributed across the world, all of which are implementing various types of ILM approach, and have this large potential to contribute to the ILM evidence base of successes and indeed, as James stressed, failures. George, over to you. George, are you muted?
Thanks for that. What I was saying is that I'm going slightly off topic. I'm not going to be talking much about the project per se. I'm going to be talking about a topic that is very relevant to that specific project. And that is sort of centering the role of development stakeholders, us included, in getting landscape approaches off the ground. So really getting them initiated and getting them ultimately scaled. There we go. I'm going to focus specifically on two specific types of actors that play a really important role in both getting landscape approach off the ground, but also in socializing landscape approaches and giving a space to local stakeholders to explore this as an opportunity for their landscape. Specifically, I'll look at the donor community that provides finance to projects that plan to introduce landscape approaches. And specifically in sort of the early phases of project implementation that are really there to help design and develop the institutional and planning structures and strategies that sort of guide long-term integrated land use management. And the second one is bridging organizations. So for bridging organizations, I'm looking here at those institutions that can act as independent facilitators in the landscape, but don't have a meaningful stake in the landscape, so no vested interest, who primarily function in terms of getting landscape approaches off the ground and helping build linkages and relationships between actors, and also the necessary capabilities to engage in collaborative action. But above all else, provides the necessary technical guidance that is needed to develop the foundational elements of landscape approaches, which in my perspective are largely the institutional and planning structures. So with regards to donors, one thing what we're realizing, and this is also integrating the sort of working with the SILM project, is that what the SILM project is, it aims to support 23 EC supported landscape projects and tries to provide technical backstopping support. So we've had a very interesting look into how these projects were conceived. And one thing we're realizing is that donors like the European Commission, for example, should have very modest expectations. If there is a group of stakeholders wants to implement a plan and approach, and we're talking about a typical funding window of say 3 years, really not much can be expected. I mean, much can be expected, but not in terms of the typical donor metrics. So the focus here is very much on the core building blocks. And the way we're seeing it is a landscape project that tries to establish itself and really stay true to the approach should spend a lot of time in establishing and socializing a common vision for the landscape. And Emily touched on this, about how complicated it is to establish a common vision and also a common vision that is inclusive of beneficiaries. A project like that should try to establish a multi-stakeholder planning and implementation structure, which is both equitable and provides equal voice. They should aim to co-develop a theory of change and implementation strategy to achieve that common vision, while at the same time also leveraging local knowledge, the resources and capabilities available to the stakeholders in the landscape, and above else, not close their eyes to complementary initiatives, of which there are usually many. But what we are noticing is that in order for those strategies to be viable and actionable, they really need to be informed by evidence. Too often, those multi-stakeholder planning processes are informed by subjectivities, personal biases, and also vested interest. So what then is there to consider as a donor? Okay, they have to realize the process this is time-consuming and complicated. It demands years of what many in the discipline call muddling through. And they should really not expect more than institutional structures, implementation strategies, and theories of change in the project cycle. If a project like that submits a proposal and says, okay, we aim to lift X many people out of poverty and conserve that many hectares of land, I, as a donor, will be extremely cautious. Those are projects that do not grasp the magnitude of really developing the foundational elements for an integrated landscape approach. And related to that is donors should consider who a project is being implemented by. And what we're seeing is that there is an acute awareness of what that means. Is that what we're seeing in the SILM projects, that technical support facility, is that many such projects are led by organizations that have personal stakes, that are not neutral, and that are largely using the landscape approach language to try to elevate and find follow-up funding for pre-existing interventions. And in situations like that, there is a risk that you rather exacerbate existing power differentials, and also there's a misuse of the language approach, of the landscape approach language, to legitimize actions that don't necessarily represent common visions of the landscape. And this is where bridging organizations like us, like CIFOR-ICRAF come in. Bridging organizations play that role. They play that role of helping navigate the complex power dynamics, the vested interests, the capacity gaps, and above else, the legacy problems and the sunk cost fallacies, which often influence the directionality of landscape approaches. They're there to close knowledge gaps that frustrate informed decision-making, and also to provide proper sequencing. And the figure on the right sort of demonstrates what a proper sequencing could look like. And in that am I almost done?
Yes, one more minute.
Cool. And in that respect, by playing a facilitatory role, it is a very delicate balance between, on the one hand, orchestrating and providing direction to the landscape planning, and also allowing and empowering stakeholders to own the process. And what we realized in GML is that if you give stakeholders too much free rein, then chances are that the strategies that come out of it are not viable, not necessarily actionable, and based on tenuous assumptions. And again, CIFOR-ICRAF has a comparative advantage in this space, but I think going forward we have to be very, very careful. And we need to be guided by a coherent strategy and also coherent understanding of what landscape approaches are. We have a lot of different projects on that, and there seems to be very divergent interpretations. And I think if we are engaged in this space, which I think is the space to be engaged in, there are serious reputational risks and unintended consequences. And not least, what we're seeing is that when funding dries up, you take a 3-year project cycle, funding dries up, multi-stakeholder processes collapse. And there might be exceptions to the rule, but in the landscape we're working with GML, for example, there were 2 such processes before us. Both of them disappeared the moment funding was gone. So there is a moral duty if we're engaged in this space, and the donors have a moral duty to ensure there is continuity. Because if we don't support, empower landscape approaches, multi-stakeholder planning in the long run, you risk turning people off to such approaches forever. And we have an important role, and I think our role is also helping donors better support and more targetedly finance proper landscape approaches. That's it, thanks.
Thanks so much, George. And our final lightning talk today will be delivered by our colleague, Dr. Delia Catacutan, who is hopefully online from the Philippines. Last year, we carried out a review of the various projects under the Landscapes for Our Future program and comparing it to an ILM framework. Delia will be talking about what we learned from that review with regards to projects in the Asia-Pacific area. Delia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kim. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone who's here joining us in this session. So as Kim mentioned earlier, my intervention in today's session is based on very early reflections and analysis and observations through our engagement with ILM projects funded by the EU. 5 amongst the 23 projects that George mentioned earlier. So I'm sharing this presentation together with Nining Liswante, our colleague from CIFOR. So these projects are our Tonle Sap project in Cambodia, ecosystem conservation through ILM in Lao PDR, strengthening integrated SLM in Inga province in Papua New Guinea, Malua Urban Resilience Initiative in Timor-Leste, and integrated SLM through deforestation-free jurisdiction in Lamdong and Dak Nong provinces in Myanmar. In Vietnam. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
We
So
hear you fine, yeah.
here on the second column, you will see the different ecosystem focus of these projects. So one can imagine how different and probably unique these projects are. So for example, the Tonle Sap project in Cambodia is dealing with at least 6 or 7 different ecosystems: a biosphere reserve, a protected area, a key biodiversity area, a wetland, grassland, forest, and agriculture. The project in Lao is on wildlife, is focusing on wildlife, wetland, forest, agriculture, a Ramsar site. And in Inga province, it's forest and agriculture. The one in Timor-Leste is more of an outlier, as it is focusing in an urban municipality. And the one in Vietnam is focusing on natural and production forests and agriculture. You can see the projects. 4 out of 5 projects have the same ILM outcome indicators based on what's presented in their project documents. And these are production, meaning the attainment of agriculture and food production, well-being in terms of human and livelihood, biodiversity and ecosystems ecosystem conservation and restoration, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and effective governance. Whereas the Malua Urban Resilience Initiative has a more narrow outcome. ILM outcome indicator. It has 4 out of the 6 ILM outcome indicators: well-being, climate change adaptation, and mitigation and governance. And not all of the projects have started at the same time as well. So what I'm sharing, as I mentioned earlier, are the challenges and reflections from the project developers and project implementers. And these are this is very far from complete or being comprehensive. This is really just initial based on our analysis on the documents, as well as through bilateral meetings and the most recent field visit or learning missions held last week. So the major challenges on the left-hand column are 4. First is there is a real limited understanding and experience of ILM by project developers and implementers. And of course, I think the previous presenters has mentioned that this is really clearly linked to the way we went to school, the way where we were trained at school. We were not trained to be, integrators. We were trained to be specialists. So there is no wonder why there's always a lack of understanding and experience in ILM project development and implementation. And another one is there's a very strong institutional bias of project developers and implementers. For example, from the 5 projects, one organization who is actually implementing 2 country projects, has a very strong focus on conservation. It's a wildlife conservation organization. So that's a very clear institutional bias. And you can imagine that the entry point to their integrated landscape management would be a single species or a single bird or something like that. So that's the institutional bias that is actually hindering a widening of the lens for integrated landscape management. So that relates again to the entry point, and the scale of intervention. And there is a sheer lack of enabling environment for integration in the project sites. Implementers like us operate in institutional silos, and that's a given context across many of these projects. So on the right-hand side, we noted some of the reflections expressed by project implementers in in these projects. So there's a realization that having various elements in a project does not always mean they are integrated. So if you just read the document, you will always see livelihoods, conservation, business, gender, and policy. All of those things are all there. The language, this language are all there, but that doesn't mean they are well integrated. Many of these projects are labeled as ILM without without negative intention. I think that is very aspirational, but demonstrating integration really remains a challenge. In fact, not to mention names, some of the project implementers were just very honest in saying that they just don't know how to integrate or what to integrate. And there's also a realization that to achieve ILM outcomes, there's really a need to understand the power dynamics of various stakeholders and to reconcile their various interests and to analyze trade-offs of various interventions. And this is no wonder. This is not a surprise. This has been mentioned by the previous speakers, Cora and James. ILM is much as a governance and institutional process that benefits from using appropriate decision-making tools. So it's always, many of ILM successes, are based on, improved effective governance and institutional processes combined or matched with appropriate decision-making tools. This is a very specific realization that biodiversity offsets do not contribute to the landscape in question. So biodiversity loss in the project area cannot be offset somewhere, outside of which is outside. Most of the offsets are actually outside of the landscape in question. So there's that's a really important realization in the projects. Engaging the private sector in PES schemes do not always lead to improved internal business practices toward ILM. We know that some PES schemes are successful, initiated or supported by the private sector, but some of them are just used to as a greenwashing mechanism. But that do not really lead to a change in internal business practices. There's landscape multifunctionality as the end goal of ILM, but there is a caveat that landscape functions are all constantly modified by stakeholders over time. So ILM plans need to be dynamic, to be long-term and adaptive. So also MSPs are a common approach to any project, but they need to be institutionalized for continuity. And also the need for institutionalizing ILM in government programs, which is very, very challenging because of the siloed nature of government institutions. So initial ways forward with a central component project that is being that is supposed to support, to provide support to this 23 LFF projects. So which is implemented by CIFOR-ICRAF. So it was suggested to have a group chat about ILM so that implementers can continue debating and learning about the conceptual and practical ways of doing ILM. Stakeholder net mapping by project implementers. Apparently, this has not been done thoroughly during the project design. Technologies and tools for ILM are also needed, and more and longer learning missions, which requires time and resources from the central component of the landscape for our future. So that's the end. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Delia. Okay, warm and significant thanks to the speakers. It's been a significant brain dump, frankly, of loads and loads of ideas, lots and lots of perceptions on the way forward. The metaphor here, of course, is maybe torches lighting up the darkness into the future. And so that's really what we want to focus on for the remainder of this session. So what we're going to do now is that we're going to post 2 provocations, we're calling them, one at a time. And when the provocation comes up, I'll ask the panelists first to react to the provocation, and then open it up to the audience and indeed to everybody who's online. We certainly welcome comments and reflections from our friends and colleagues who are joining us from elsewhere. Please put up your hand if you want to comment or say something. We haven't got much time left in the session, so let's start with the first one. So the first provocation is that landscape approaches are old wine in new bottles. Another faddish development concept, too complicated or complex to implement. So would anybody from the panel, including you, Emily, the panelists online, and indeed Cora and James, like to jump in with a reaction to that statement? Cora, please.
Yeah, thank you. I love this statement because actually I do love old wine, and I also like fancy new bottles. An approach that has been in existence for a few hundred of years, has proven to be good, needs to be revamped and contextualized. And I think as compared to the past, the local conditions have improved a lot. In most countries, there is decentralization, there is a great empowerment, and there are educated landscape actors. So the more that local development proceeds, the more likely that landscape approaches were valid, are valid, and will be valid even more. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So the wine will be on you next time we meet in person. I think there was another hand up. Was that George or James? Delia, why don't you go for it?
Yeah, thank you, Kim. I think I'd agree with Cora. I mean, the reason why it's bottled in a different way because nobody learns from it, and it's faddish because again, it has been there, but nobody really was very serious about it. Thank you, and it's complicated for sure.
Anybody else from the panel? Final reflection on? Can I open it up to the participants? Anybody here in the hall with us would like to react to that? Nope. Yep. You're looking hesitant.
Well, what strikes it strikes me that a lot of the challenges that have been addressed by the various speakers today arise from the fact that these ILM approaches are always introduced from outside. Are there examples where they've actually come out of the communities engaged themselves, who have then pulled in the expertise they need? And does that provide fewer challenges that way?
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, I just wanted to continue on the point that Cora and Delia were raising now, in that it's not really a problem that these are concepts that have been developed over time, because in a certain way, all of these processes that are involved in integrated landscape management are ongoing. And what we're trying to do in this work is make people more conscious of these processes and how they interact, so that we can have more intentional influence over them, rather than having it just be trial by error or letting things work out on their own, but trying to have some intention in what's changing on our landscape and having some attempt at trying to influence the change.
Thank you, Peter. George, online.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, to me, I think there are new and innovative aspects to the landscape approaches compared to the integrated rural development and national resource management. I mean, issues of social inclusion, participation, co-creation, multi-stakeholder planning, participatory adaptive governance. I mean, these are sort of concepts which have emerged and being integrated into the landscape approaches that I do think is distinct. The practice, however, from what I'm seeing, it is really rebranding the old. And I think a lot of development stakeholders are opportunistic, because by branding it as landscape approaches, they can get funding, but often lack the understanding and capacity, as Delia also pointed out, to implement them effectively. So a lot of the approaches are not multi-sectoral in nature, or do not really involve genuine multi-stakeholder planning processes, and have completely obscure sequencing. So I think there's a lot wrong with how many such projects are being implemented. And again, I think that's a space where we should insert ourselves more aggressively.
Great, thanks, George. We have a comment from Stephen Laurie. Interventions can be understood as resources offered to land users with the intention of solving problems believed relevant to land users. At the end of the day, interventions can be considered successful only if land users consider them useful to solving those problems and adopt them accordingly. That said, land users may find interventions useful in ways not anticipated by project planners, but very often they don't find them useful at all, hence the poor uptake of donor, etc. interventions. Cora has also raised her hand for another comment. Sorry, I'm sorry, Emily, yes.
So just to respond to the comment here in the room, I mean, I would agree with what the other panelists have said, and that the social and the practical uptake has changed. There is a lot more capacity on the ground for some of these development concepts that have been around for a very long time. So we are seeing a lot more peers to work with in the field. But why is it still so complicated and difficult to implement and it still looks the same? It's because the structures and institutions haven't changed. I mean, bureaucracies are still institutionalized into silos, and multi-stakeholder approaches have to work across those silos. There are no budgets to do that without external donor funding. So that's why it always does look like the outside coming in to grease the wheels and make things move, because the structures still don't allow for it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Hold on, Cora, we'll get to you.
A short one, Patrick Worms here. The issues that you identified, George, remind me of the issues that are also affecting the concept of agroecology. The more I think about it, the more I wonder if the two approaches, the landscape approach and the ecological approach, are not largely synonymous to one another. And I'd love for somebody who knows both well to comment on that.
Okay. Cora, did you have a comment?
Several. The speaker who's just speaking, agroecology, I think it's complementary, maybe not similar, but the two could go very well hand in hand. But I want to respond to the speaker before, the lady whose name I don't know. I think we've reached the end of what we call, the end of what we call good governance. Good governance has been promoted for decades now, and very much translated in the administrative sense, procedural sense. But I think the whole concept of borders and boundaries has been turned upside down. All conflicts, almost all conflicts in this world are about border disputes. So I think we need to move from classical administrations and jurisdictions to much more of a landscape thinking in governance and in management. That's, I think, the spatialization or the spatiality that is bitterly needed. That's quite novel, and I think your communities of place is something that was said this morning is super relevant to this. In addition, responding to governments or donors who are not able to anticipate to this trend. If I look at the Dutch government, that's hilarious. Yes, they are in for an experiment. They are so in for financing landscape programs, but their administrative system does not allow because landscape action doesn't fit in any of the existing budget lines, which is water, climate, food, and sexual, reproductive, whatever. And second, the computer system is not able to handle the complexity of landscape programs. I find that so hilarious, really. Thank you.
Okay. Peter Menang, are you here? No, there you go.
Thanks. I think very interesting discussion. I think one of the things that I haven't heard in the whole afternoon is time. The way we interpret and conceptualize landscapes and landscape approaches is that there is a rigid time frame to it. When you look at the table that Delia put forward, I mean, the average time frame was 5 years. That's not how it happens. It will never happen that way. We need to think about landscapes as processes that go over time. Trust is a key variable. You don't build trust in 2-3 years. That doesn't happen. If you look at a lot of the landscape approaches, the few that have been really successful, it takes time. It does take time. The second thing that I think we need to be able to look at, and I think a lot of the speakers have alluded to in what they said, is, and even in the last discussion, let's not dream that donor funding is ever going to make landscape successful. It will never happen. We only have 2 avenues to make that happen. To make sure that governments, as institutions, we are making business cases for landscapes to be able to build and work on their own. If we cannot bring business cases and make landscapes viable from a business perspective, what we will do is, as Delia was alluding to, as where landscapes have been largely successful from the conservation perspective. So you get green landscapes with poor people that are poor, what I call green poverty, right? If we don't have the business case, forget it. The second alternative we have is to convince government that there is a business case for investing in the landscape approach, so that the minimum that government can put in from a developing country perspective can help that move forward. And that is where I think the marriage between what Cora was talking about in terms of how do you link the jurisdictional approaches and the planning approaches to coincide with the landscape planning approaches is extremely important. If landscapes aren't planned, the development visions of the governments and the aspirations of the time that are linked to the decisions, and decisions that are linked to money, So if there is any one thing that we could do to bring to this debate, I appreciate the multi-stakeholder approaches. I appreciate all of that. But these 2 things don't happen. We will do nice projects, we will finish them, and we won't change anything.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I'm going to take one more comment from James Reed on this provocation, and then we'll move on to the second one. So quickly, James.
Hi, Kim. Sorry, I jumped off the call, so I apologise if I'm repeating what's already been said. But I was asked this question back in 2014, and the simple answer, I think the reason I was asked then is because there was a paper that just came out from Kent Redford about fads in conservation. And the fact is, landscape approaches will be a fad. There's no doubt, because all of these concepts ultimately end that way. But I think the important thing is to acknowledge that the move towards integration is necessary, because we know from the problems we're still facing from sectorial approaches, the integration is necessary. So it's important that we retain the lessons learned from integrated landscape approaches for whatever the next fad might be. The only person I heard was Peter, and I completely agree that with regards to the time constraint. I mean, there's been studies showing that even building capacity takes 20 years. So these short-term project models are obviously insufficient. So how we institutionalize landscape approaches is obviously crucial.
Okay, thank you. And thanks so much for all of the inputs and thoughts around that first provocation. Can we have the second provocation? So here we're trying to move the spotlight into the future. The second statement is that successful ILM is dependent on strong stakeholder coordination and management, and the combination of skill sets, including negotiation, convening, and facilitation. So what we were really thinking of here is that in some respects, there has to be a shift in focus away from more contemporary skill sets to some of these kinds here when it comes to effective ILM implementation. Panelists, would any of you like to react to this one? Emily agrees, has nothing further to say. Anybody from, okay, we've got raised hands. Do you know who? Delia, please.
Yes, this is completely true. However, the next problem is who is going to do this? which are George talked about boundary organizations, and boundary organizations are also rare to find. And in many of these cases nowadays, the boundary organizations are being taken by NGOs who doesn't have any permanence also in a given landscape. So this is, nobody I think disagrees with this, but the problem is the who is going to do this. Who is the convener? Who is the negotiator and facilitator for integrated landscape management? And that's, it goes back to Peter's point about governments. And I reading the chat, there's a lot of comments about governments being so laid back, not changing, so static in their approaches. So what do we do from the research side? So we can only demonstrate through a project, but sustainability remains a question.
Thank you, Delia. Cora?
Yeah, I think I don't agree with the statement. Stakeholder coordination and management implies that it's led by an external actor who comes in to coordinate and manage. If you would replace it by stakeholder collaboration and governance, then I may agree, because that is much more showing that actors themselves are in the driver's seat. And I think that's a must. That's absolute beginning. So conveners, I always have difficulties with the word convener, because who is the one that jumps in and convenes? Is it a project? Is it a researcher? Is it a foreign company? I have very much difficulties with that. I think it's only the people on the ground that make the change, and supporting, allowing them to scale their efforts and break through all these glass ceilings and get involved in political decision making. That's the way to change landscapes, I believe.
Thank you. Peter, again?
No, Cora was really spot on. The first point that she made is really excellent. It's about, I will add another point to it. What is missing in this statement is ownership. If they don't own the process, forget it. Because coordination and management doesn't imply ownership of that, right? And I think two more things to add to that. I think the stakeholders need to be able to be involved in the action rather than just the negotiation, convening, and facilitation. They need to be involved in owning it, the action, and most importantly, investing in the process. Because what a lot of what we've presupposed in the projects that we are doing is that we are working with external investment. And that's too short a stay. If we can't make the business case for that investment to come from the local system, it won't work.
Multifunctional landscapes project, which we've mentioned a couple of times today. We are at that stage right now where each of the working groups, they develop their own development strategy. We did a fundraising workshop with them. We're working on developing the business case and the fundraising strategy. And I feel like we as a boundary organization could use much more capacity building. We've known from the beginning of the project that in order for these working groups to survive, that we would need to go through this operationalization. And the question is open. They've served their purpose for the project. Do you want to institutionalize this? How do we do that? How do we get it into the government budget cycles? The assemblies are there at our meetings. The planning officers are there. We've talked to the budget officers. And we really don't have the training to do it. So we need to work with their expertise about how to move towards the next step of institutionalization. And not every piece of that platform will be institutionalized. Some pieces they found valuable. Some pieces they don't want to continue. So, I think to this point, there have to be resources. We have to know how to harvest those resources. And as boundary organization, we don't necessarily have that skill set. Some of that skill set exists within those stakeholder groups themselves, but they also don't have the time. So one thing that our project does provide is the time to come together and just do the meetings. We're not even always there. So they've taken a lot of ownership over it, but how do you keep it alive? And it's a challenge.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, I think Emily's response just covered a little bit of what I was going to say, which kind of brings us back to Earth. That back to reality, if local collaboration was going to solve the problem, they'd be solving all the problems. So there is obviously a need for some kind of facilitation, and that is because communities are already being intervened in hundreds of ways by governments, by projects, and being told what to do. So there has to be a facilitating space to make something else possible. And that's something that an external facilitator like us could provide, or a local academic institution, a local research institution that is in the landscape, but perhaps without the kind of stake that George was saying that the facilitator shouldn't have. The other thing I wanted to say is I think I disagree a bit with Cora on the point she made earlier about not corresponding with jurisdictions. Because my understanding of the history of integrated landscape and development conservation, ICDPs, whatever they are, was that one of the big failings was precisely they were not corresponding with any kind of government jurisdiction, which meant nothing ever got institutionalized anywhere. We still have massive challenges to make that happen. And one of the challenges that we've found from different research projects where we've asked this question is that if the government entity doesn't have, if a desk at government, my terms of reference doesn't include in my responsibilities communicating and networking with that office over there, I won't do it. I don't have an incentive to do it, and sometimes I have a strong disincentive because if I do things that aren't in my TOR, I can get in trouble. So there's a whole other piece here to helping simple changes, I think, in government like that, I think could be quite significant.
We'll come to you just now, James.
Just a very simple point. I don't see anything in the statement about being externally driven, and of course, ideally, but it would be someone among the stakeholders who would be driving these things. But you need a champion. You need someone to bring people together. I can't see practically how it would work unless someone is bringing people together. And the ideal is for that to come from within, but initially it may come from. You need to identify a champion or a convener and hand over.
Great, thank you. James, did you have a comment?
I think most of what I was going to say was already addressed by both Emily and Anne. But I think, I generally agree with the statement, but I think this idea that we need to leave communities to themselves to resolve, I don't really agree with that, because I think, there's both a lack of capacity, there's a lack of rights there, but also as these communities are increasingly confronted with external forces and globalization and large private sector organizations, then the capacity there just isn't there. So I think they do need the external support or some kind of structure in place that enables the integrated landscape approach to continue. Because certainly what our experience has shown in Zambia is that they've had a whole history of projects coming and going, and there's a huge fanfare when the project arrives, and then everyone just disappears and there's nothing said at the end of the project. So I think this is a really important challenge, and I think it's naive to think that communities can just manage these challenges themselves.
Thank you. Mina, did you have? Oh, Mika, sorry. No. Mina, online?
Are you calling me?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I don't know.
Sorry, I didn't quite recognize the pronunciation of my name. And I think the one thing that we haven't heard at all this afternoon is the role of forest and forestry organizations. And I think Cora correctly mentioned that the typical part of landscape approaches is being able to give the vertical connection. And the case we started 20 years ago in Sumberjaya was we could resolve a lot of conflicts by basically challenging some of the basic concepts that exist within Ministry of Forestry about what forest is and does with respect to water, and challenging the biophysical concepts behind their stuff opened the space for institutional change. And yes, when we asked practitioners of landscape approaches in Indonesia a couple of years ago what the constraints are. It turned out about half are solvable within landscapes, and the other half comes from above. Yeah, so specifically when we look at CIFOR-ICRAF, our role is as much to consolidate in the education of foresters and forestry people, the next generation, that the concept of forest has to change and has to be multifunctional and has to be linked in with all this and that. Unless we do that, we go back to the same problem every next generation, every new batch of foresters coming and not having been trained in handling these things. So I think there is a lot of role specifically for CIFOR-ICRAF to take this thing into a longer term vision beyond the specific landscape level continuity that we talk about. Thanks.
Thank you, Nina. George.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate what Cora is saying, but I do have to completely agree with James and some of the things that Anne is also bringing up. Is that, okay, it's one thing about having people brought together, but there are some very practical things that need to happen if you want to do this right and have long-term solutions. And this institutionalization issue is key. And it requires a lot of skills and a lot of support to engage and navigate the complex bureaucracy for those purposes. And not to mention, it requires a lot of resources to bring government stakeholders around the table. I mean, we've been seeing during these multi-stakeholder processes is that if you don't pay those per diems, there's nobody there. They'll send you an intern. And it's the same thing with thinking about, okay, communities need better services, but there is absolutely zero capacity to effectively engage the private sector. So I think bridging organizations are key. Bridging organizations need to come in very, very early to also build the skill sets that communities that have perhaps self-organized need to engage those stakeholders effectively. Because if you don't, I think there are all sorts of capture risks and ultimately failure problems.
Okay, great. Thanks, George. Cora?
Yes, sorry, I'm too busy thinking so many nice things which are being said. I want to react to Mena. Mena, yeah, I've learned so much from you. So this is one of these things. The roles of forests have changed. So our understanding needs to be changed. And the change comes from education. That's where the professionals learn their conceptualizations. I think exactly the same is now needed for landscapes. Now that we professionals think we understand how landscapes work, we also think that there is a need for new framing. And again, that starts from education. So this whole restoration and this landscape thinking, there is not a single curriculum in this world that provides professionals with the skill sets that they need to manage and initiate these processes on the ground. That's actually, I want to do a bit of promotion here. We're just starting a new program on restoration education together with Wageningen and NGLF. And we really want to transform education and create these integrated curricula for a new flock or cohort of professionals that have these complementary skill sets that are able to think intersectorally, interdisciplinary, and inter-stakeholder. How do I say that? Multi-stakeholder. We really need CIFOR, we need you scientists for this ICRAF. Please join in and let's make this big because it's bitterly needed.
Thanks very much. Delia.
No, thanks, Kim. I think I have nothing more to add. I think that everything has been said well. The capacity building, as I mentioned, the first challenge in the Asia Pacific LFA projects is the lack or limited experience and knowledge about ILM. So that really connects to the need for professionals trained in ILM, which is a major problem with the way our educational system is, working because of the training on specialization in forestry, in agriculture, in water, etc. So I think that Cora's intervention is it has been long overdue, in fact, Cora, right? The training, the capacity building of new professionals, and also Mina's point about the going back to the professionals that need to work on landscapes. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. All right, and then a final comment from James Reed, and then I think we have to close the session. We've already run a little bit over time. James.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, just building on what George was saying about these kind of boundary organisations, I think potentially as well there's a need for some sort of watchdog for integrated landscape approaches. I mean, there is such a proliferation now, and even this statement saying successful ILM, who defines what success is? And I think there's the danger that these landscape approaches are being co-opted now by private sector organisations, or even the jurisdictional approaches. And I think we need to have some kind of watchdog that is assessing and providing that critical lens of what's happening to the local communities and the people on the ground that aren't able to access these processes. So that was all I really wanted to say.
Those are excellent concluding comments. So thank you very much to you all, in particular the presenters to this session, all 5 of you, and then to your participation both here and globally. Thank you so much. That's the end of the session. Wishing you a good night and good evening. Thank you.